since we're doing this for Hurricane Preparedness Week, let's start with what happened last year and the purpose for our story. You know, you draw attention. I think you talked to Alexis and said, I'd like to do a story about this. So what kind of caught your eye over what's happened over the last 12 months?
Sure. So last year, of course, we saw excessive heat, an excessively long period of no rain, drought, and that sort of thing. Prior to that, actually, we saw some winters that were a little out of sorts for South Louisiana, right? Some frost, some snow, some ice, all those kinds of things. And so trees are response organisms. And so as we see those things in their memory, they respond to that. And so last year was sort of the tipping point, or the straw that broke the camel's back, if you were, for trees. Too much heat, too much period for no rain, lack of water, and so they can't do their process like they want to do, right? Photosynthesis, they can't create sugars and starches and that sort of thing. It all starts with the sun driving photosynthesis for the tree to keep it moving in the right direction, and it can build up sugars and starches and use that for food and storage in its trunk. But last year, having too much sun and having a long period of no water, it's missing some components to do chemistry in the tree, which is that photosynthesis is driven by sun, but it's also driven by water uptake. So the 30 trees that we're seeing a lot of stress with right now, a lot of mortality, the highest mortality would be oaks, magnolias, and pines. And we see the pine trees displaying that very early in the fall, winter, and we saw that drastic orange in these pine trees because they're an evergreen. We would expect them to be green through the fall and winter. That's what the term evergreen, to have green leaves all year long. And so a lot of these pine trees did not exhibit that. And as soon as they started having these orange, yellow, orange, red canopies, leaves if you were needles, then insects moved in. Ips beetles moved in and then kind of have been knocking those trees out. And then we moved into the fall, winter with oaks and magnolias. Oak trees, we would suspect them, because they're deciduous, to lose their leaves and be okay in the fall, winter. But then as spring showed up, they didn't put leaves back out, or no leaves or partial canopies came back out. And so we really get to see the full breadth of kind of the devastating summer to oak trees last year. Magnolias, a little bit different. Magnolias are evergreen, but they're super sensitive. They're oftentimes planted in the wrong space, and people, you know, it breaks their heart sometimes, but magnolias are really designed to be in the shade of themselves or shade of the forest. And so they like that dense shade. They don't like the full sun. And so when they're in the full sun and they're planted in the wrong space, they're already going through some stressors. And so the last year's drought just added another stress factor they simply couldn't overcome.
So we talked about magnolias and pines, and before we're going on camera, you were telling me a little about oaks, and we have several different species of oaks around here. Maybe run through a couple of the common ones and the ones within that, the subgroups that are a little more prone.
Sure. So we have about 20 oak species that are native to South Louisiana, and of those two groups of trees, there are two groups of trees in that oak classification. One is a red oak group and one is a white oak group. And so of those two groups, the water oak seems to be the tree that has been hammered the most. Water oak characteristically has a hollow cavity on the inside of the tree. It's very weak. We saw during previous hurricanes, Gustav and Rita and so forth and so on, Andrew, that a lot of giant red oaks, but those are really water oaks, were lost because of this hollow structure. They're simply weak, and they're simply a poor design. They don't have good branch angles, and they don't have branch collars and whatnot that are supportive of that. So water oak is probably the worst of the oak tree to have in your yard. Some of the oak trees, maybe nuttall oak tree, maybe cow oak tree, those are two white oaks, maybe cherry bark oak trees. Those are some of the better ones to have in your yard. They're typically a little stronger. Any tree that's young will do better than any tree that's old. So if I have a younger water oak tree and it lived, or I have an older cherry bark and it died, you may say, well, Scott had that mixed up. No, it's young versus old. So it's the same thing for us. A young person, my son is 19, if he falls and hurts himself, he's going to recover much faster than I am at 50. If I fall and hurt myself, it's going to take me a while, right, to get over that. So trees are sort of the same way in that. So of the oak species, there's some to stay away with, certainly water oak. Now, typically people don't plant that tree. Typically that tree is, it's a prolific cedar. Squirrels love that tree, and so because it puts out so many acorns, you can find it in your landscape. People love trees in general, and because they do, when that sprouts up, it's either misidentified or they just keep it because it's a tree. But that tree is a terrible urban tree. Cherry bark is a little bit better. and a little bit by saying that it can be giant, like this tree behind me, a giant trunk, which is intimidating. And so that's why I like Nuttall, fits the bill a little better. That's the favorite tree that I like to plant. Willow oak is a great tree. Live oak is a great tree. Cow oak is a great tree to plant. So those 4 or 5 are the ones I would stick with for sure.
What are some signs we're looking for? Maybe we still have some green leaves on. Somebody seeing this would look for that it might be time to give y'all a call and take a tree out ahead of the season.
That's correct. So in most trees you can see a full canopy. This time of year, if your tree has a full green canopy, then it should be okay and good to go, and it sort of made it through the last season. You can still do some maintenance, and you should do some maintenance things like mulching, watering, fertilizing, trimming when appropriate, all those things to keep the health of the tree moving in the right direction. But if you look in your yard and you look at your tree and you see some tip dieback, that would be small limbs that are on the outside of the canopy of the tree, the outside of the crown of the tree, that exhibit no leaves. They're brown, they're dead. Or in my yard, if I see some limb debris falling out of my tree in my yard, those can be some great indicators that something's going on with my tree. If over a couple of years you start to notice that more and more of those limbs are falling in my yard, or more and more tip dieback is happening, then you can sort of make an educated decision that something's happened to my tree, it's declining. If you see something worse than that, like termite trails on the tree, certainly you can see that. We're seeing a lot of hypoxylon canker on trees. That is a fungus that flies around, attacks oak trees, and it sloughs the bark off. So if giant pieces of bark are being sloughed off of your tree, all those things are great indicators that it's time to call a consulting arborist to your yard, and let's take a look at it and see what's going on.
I guess the last thing I'd add is, to tie it into the hurricane season angle, we have these damaged trees. If they're not removed, how much more vulnerable are they? What kind of stresses can they stand up to? It's hard to predict. Yes, this one will come down in this storm or this type of wind, but is there any kind of relative sense like, hey, a daily thunderstorm versus a hurricane, this thing's not going to survive?
Right. So I guess in general, if you just looked at the textbook, of course, things with leaves would have more drag and it would have a bigger surface area. So if I have a weakened tree, and let's say I notice part of the tree is dying or slough off at the trunk, but it still has green leaves, that tree can still be a great candidate for removal. A dead tree is a good candidate for removal as well, but it may not have as much surface area. I guess the first thing you need to look at from an arborist perspective is what's the highest risk tree. So if I have a piece of property that's got 20 acres and I've got a dead tree in the back of it, nobody lives by it, there's no house, no road, no power line, that would not rank nearly as high as an oak tree by my house that is devoid of any leaves, it's dead, it's got a rotten trunk, and it may fall on my house or my car, hurt myself, hurt property, hurt my neighbor. Those are high-risk trees that need to be dealt with first, right? And I'm a consumer like anybody else, right? So people ask me all the time, well, we don't have the money to take care of that. Well, if you're a property owner and you own that property, you own that tree, and you own the benefits for that. In other words, you can sit under it and have a picnic and shade and enjoy the squirrels and things that enjoy that tree. Likewise, if it's dead, you also own that liability. And that's the problem that people don't really understand, is that if I have this risk factor, it's my job as the property owner to get rid of that risk. And turning your head and saying, whatever, you could be liable for that. If the tree fell and hurt or killed somebody or hit a car or a house, you're going to be liable for that. So high-risk trees closer to property, home, closer to the targets, high-risk targets, kids, playgrounds, schools, all those things are what I would say need to go first. Trees that are in the back 40, so to speak, that are out of sight, out of mind, or in a wooded area, maybe those trees don't need to be dealt with as quickly as high-risk trees.
Are we looking at, say we were to get a hurricane this year, we'd be looking at a quick clear-out event of all these dead trees?
I would say there's going to be a purge, is what I've been telling my customers, right? So trees that we're still in this stress period for trees, and there's a lot of trees being taken down for sure, likewise, but yes, if we get high winds, the tree behind us, if we get the high wind that we had last year with Ida, or 2 years ago with Ida, we get that high wind again, 125 that came through, we get that high wind, for sure you can see maybe not the whole tree go down, but for sure you can see big enough limbs to put a hole in someone's roof. It only takes a 1-inch limb, 2-inch limb to put a hole in your roof. You get a hole in your roof, you get water in your house now, you got a giant problem. And you get hit by a limb that's got 1 or 2 inches coming down on your head, you got a giant problem. So the risk is big, right? But the responsibility is big also.
We're good.